I've often wondered what it must have been like to have a lesson with Johann Sebastian Bach. We still have plenty of the music he wrote for his students, but we don't really know what happened in those lessons. If someone played this, what would Bach have said? Would he have stopped them after the first phrase? Would he have talked about touch or character? Or would he simply have played it himself? We'll never know. Those lessons disappeared the moment they ended. Or at least, that's what I used to think. A few years after Bach died, his son Carl Philipp Emanuel published a book on keyboard playing. It's not a book by Johann Sebastian Bach. Carl Philipp never says that it is. But he grew up learning from his father. In fact, he later said that in composition and keyboard playing, he never had any teacher other than his father. And reading this book made me wonder about something I'd never really thought about before. Could this be the closest thing we'll ever have to Bach's own thoughts on playing the keyboard? Not because Bach wrote it, but because his son has spent years learning directly from him. The first thing that struck me was that this isn't simply a book about technique. The further I got into it, the more I realized that Carl Philipp's idea of keyboard playing was much broader. Fingering, ornamentation, accompaniment, thorough bass, improvisation. And running through all of it is the question of how you turn musical knowledge into actual music. Expression, character, singing, performance. As I read it, I found myself thinking less about playing the keyboard and more about making music. And that began to remind me of something about Bach's own teaching. He doesn't seem to have thought of performing, composing, harmony and improvising as completely separate subjects. Look at the inventions. Bach tells us what they're for. They teach the student to play clearly in 2 parts, then 3. But he also says they should lead towards a cantabile manner of playing, a singing way of playing, and give the student a strong foretaste of composition. That combination is fascinating. Playing clearly, playing in a singing way, and learning how music is actually made. That's the world I kept recognizing in his son's book. The aim isn't simply to produce a good keyboard player, it's to produce a complete musician. So I went back to the 4th Partita. I played this piece for years, but I found myself listening differently. Every phrase seemed to have a purpose. Every pause felt deliberate. The music wasn't just unfolding, it was speaking. Then I came to the Allemande. I've always loved this movement, but I'd never really thought about why it feels so natural. The more I listened, the more I heard it as a singer might. And this is where I began to hear his father in the background. Bach had said something remarkably similar in the preface to the Inventions. One of their purposes was to teach the player a cantabile manner of playing, literally a singing way of playing. And here, a generation later, his son is still thinking about the keyboard in much the same way. Not simply as an instrument on which you press the right notes, but as something that has to speak and sing. Reading Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach didn't change the notes. It changed what I was listening for. Then the saraband. There's almost nowhere to hide. Everything depends on expression. The notes are only the beginning. One sentence stayed with me. Carl Philipp Emanuel says that good keyboard playing depends on fingering, embellishment and performance. Performance. I found that interesting. Today, it's easy to think of performance as the last stage. First we learn the notes, then we polish them, Only then do we focus on interpretation. This book doesn't separate those things. Listen to the opening again. This is the same performance we heard at the beginning. But listen now to the relationship between the notes. Where the phrase is going, which voice matters, where there's tension, where it releases, whether the line actually sings. The notes haven't changed, the performance hasn't changed. What's changed is what we're listening for. And perhaps that's what I hadn't expected from this book. Technique matters enormously, but technique is always pointing beyond itself. There are other things in the book that made the connection hard to ignore. Carl Philipp treats harmony and thorough bass as practical musicianship. A player should understand what they're playing. They should be able to accompany, they should be able to improvise. An ornamentation isn't simply decoration added afterwards. It's part of how the music speaks, how notes connect, where they have weight, and how a phrase comes alive. None of that proves that every idea came directly from Johann Sebastian. It couldn't. Carl Philipp belonged to his own generation. Musical taste was changing rapidly around him. But it does suggest a musical culture in which technique, harmony, accompaniment, improvisation, and expression all belong together. And that feels remarkably close to the world of Bach's surviving teaching music. So is this Bach's lost treatise? No, I don't think we can say that. Carl Philipp Emanuel wasn't simply an extension of his father. He belonged to a different generation, and his own music often sounds very different. But those underlying priorities are difficult to ignore. And when they appear in such detail in a book written by the son who actually learned from him, it's difficult to wonder how much of the father's teaching we're hearing at one remove. That's why I think this book is so valuable. Not because it gives us Bach's exact words, but because it comes from someone who knew his musical world from the inside. The more I've read the book, and the more I play Carl Philipp Emanuel's own music, the more I found myself going back to his father's music. Not looking for rules, just listening differently. Perhaps that's its greatest value. It doesn't tell us exactly how Bach played, but it does help us think about the musical values he passed on to the next generation. And somehow, that makes me hear the music differently.